So we have more characters than 31. It follows the same advice in this. So what you're saying was if you are streaming, we then say data, we don't take
All right, if everybody could take their seats, we'll get started here shortly.
Hello, everybody. We're starting. So you are in a CBOR working group meeting right now. So if that's not where you want to be, please, you're aware of that. So today we have an acting chair, Matt. Joe cannot be here, so thank you, Matt. You have the mailing list link, the Jabber, and the Etherpad for minutes. So we're looking for volunteers. Take minutes. Anybody? Okay, great. Paul is taking minutes. Thank you, Paul. First of all, the note well, as you're all aware, you're being recorded, and this is an ITF contribution, and you're supposed to follow the rules defining this to RFC. So yeah, minutes are taken, this meeting is recorded, and your presence is logged, and I'm gonna start passing the blue sheets, yes. And also we need the Jabber scribe. Anybody else? Jabber? Michael? I volunteer you. You're Mitico, you can get Mitico, the. Okay, Michael, the other Michael. Thanks. So yeah, just to remind you that we have a working group GitHub. Right now it contains the CBOR and the CDDL documents, as well as other extensions documents. The authors are welcome to put their draft there if they want. But again, significant discussion has to go to the mailing list. This is the agenda for today. So after this introduction, Karsten will present the status for the CBOR draft. And Karsten and Hank will talk about CDDL. Again, Karsten for the array tags document, which is in the charter, and then after that, the next two documents are not in the charter, and this is the time tags and the CBOR tag for CBOR templates. Okay, so another tag will be presented, and after that, wrap up, and we only have 10 minutes of free time between all this, so we'll try to be either faster or follow this timeline. Thank you. Anything to say about the agenda? Anything to add? I think Sean will add something at the end of the meeting, and that's it. Okay, Karsten.
Oh, you don't.
monitor not working?
I gave you
Are
the.
you using that?
Yes.
Sorry, I'm
If you
used
want to
to
use-
chairs that are less. Okay.
I don't think it worked. It stopped working last session. And they poked it, but it didn't.
You prefer to use yours, just use yours.
No, I will just do a dual screen play here.
Okay.
With two controllers.
No, but you can just take yours if that's easier. So I can also
Okay.
take control of my computer.
not get off media.
Yeah, it's nice to have computer while you're sharing. Oh, wrong meeting, sorry.
Okay,
Oh, which one is which?
that's the rooms.
Okay. Okay. Okay, thank you. We wanted to minimize the amount of swapping, so yeah, it kind of got to me to lead those slots, but that of course doesn't mean that my co-authors won't run to the microphone and fix what I've said. So Henk is already very close to the microphone. Okay, so the first one is specification status. And before I get to that, I just want to relate an impression, just a very subjective impression. Ari and I ran a workshop over the weekend about semantic and hypermedia interoperability for IoT. We had some 8 standards meetings, standards organizations. I do, but okay. Yeah. So I'm going to. This is not good audio quality. How do I do this? I need a spacer that keeps constant distance from my face.
You're fine. Thank you.
Okay. So we had some 8 standards organizations there. And it was interesting to see that, of course, everyone has still some XML somewhere. Everyone is using JSON for all new stuff. And it's interesting to see that many of them then actually interchange CBOR. So I think we have some acceptance, at least in these standards development organizations. That doesn't mean that your light switch at home already uses CBOR, but at least the standards organizations seem to have gotten the message. And one interesting other observation here is that a lot of these send CBOR over the wire, but actually use JSON tools for doing all their work. So they are using formats like Swagger 2, which is defined for JSON. And yeah, that's maybe a hint that we should be doing some work in this space too. Okay, and there's also JSON schema in there, and it was interesting to hear that at least some of the organizations are now moving away from that. So what do we have to do to get the CBOR specification to internet standard? That's the name of the stage according to RFC 6410. So first of all, we cannot just move the existing specification with the existing RFC number to internet standard because we have errata. Actually, those errata are in the explanatory text. There's nothing really normative that is affected by the errata. So if you read 6410, we are kind of clear here because the errata are just bad examples. But yeah, let's fix that and fix another few things as well. So that is already done in the current working group draft. People do tell us that the text in some places is not so good. So we get input about opportunities for editorial improvement. Let's use those opportunities. There also are some violations of the principle of least surprise. And we may want to do something on the editorial front there as well, explain how this is different from what people might be reading out of the text, and yeah, maybe why that is so. Then we probably do want to revisit the IANA considerations. In 2013, we said, let's have very, very liberal IANA considerations, so everybody can just go ahead and register something. And I'm not proposing to change this completely, but we may want to be a bit more conservative with the spaces we have. And then finally, we have to generate an actual document, the request for reclassification, and RFC 6410 tells us what's in there. So let's talk about the one thing that I think we really have to decide, and that doesn't have a clear-cut answer. So right now we have two registries in CBOR. One is the CBOR tags registry, and one is the simple values registry. Now the simple values registry hasn't actually been tapped by other bodies or by other documents at all. So right now we are still in the original state that 7049 left. I have some slides at the end, if I get to them, where I could show how that might change. So we may not want to completely ignore that, although we don't have an emergency there at the moment. On the tag side, in the tags registry, we already were careful with the good tags that can be represented in 1 byte. So these have standards action as registration policy, but we have already consumed 50% of them. And for a document that is 4 years old and it's supposed to last a little bit longer than 4 more years, that is kind of concerning. But again, we have standard action there, so maybe we just want to write a little bit more what we expect the IASG to do here when reviewing consuming another one of those tags. Now we also have a almost as good range, which is larger, a 2-byte tag, a tag with 1 byte header and 1 byte additional information. And of that space, we have 8.2% taken, but we have several documents there which eat another 10% in 1 byte. So we may want to think about that some more. But also, this is specification required. So if Joe Sixpack comes along and says, I have this specification and that needs 193 tags in that space, and Joe Sixpack has a specification, they will get the space. So maybe we want to do something about this space, because to keep this space here clear, we have to have control over this space. And finally, we have a lot of space, of which 10 are taken, and I'm not worried about this part. So what could we do? We could move the 2-byte range for tags, and maybe why we do this, the 2-byte range for simple, to expert review, which is 1 notch up from specification required. Both actually require an expert review, because if Joe Sixpack comes and says, I have a specification, which is that tweet, which I wrote 5 minutes ago, we are probably not going to accept that as a specification. And you need an expert to make that decision. So we are already doing a little bit of pushback in that space, but we can only do so much. So going to expert review with some clear guidelines what needs to be fulfilled, so some of this space can be used. That would be one way forward. So this is just a straw man of what might be in those guidelines. And we also can retrospectively think about our own allocation. So for instance, we gave UUIDs a 2-byte tag. Now UUIDs are 16 bytes. So was that justified? I think so, but let's think about that a little bit. And one other thing we may want to do That's not supported by the current IANA registration guidelines. 8216, is that the right number? Just came out again. We might want to put in a circuit breaker there, which means when we reach 50% usage of a space, we actually change the guidelines by which the expert operates. And what we also might want to do, just as we need the second range to keep the first range clear, we might keep some of the third range a little bit clearer, the 3-byte range, to move things over from the second range. Michael.
Michael Richardson, I think if you want to put the circuit breaker in, you need to redefine the second half of the space to have an expert review with different criteria. So you just have 2 expert criteria ranges, and there you're done. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. Now, one thing is, sometimes it's a good idea to allocate a contiguous range, and you may want to allocate a contiguous range in a different space. Let's take that offline. Good point. Okay, so this is something that has to be decided, and thank you for the input to that. So we probably want to discuss this a little bit more on the mailing list and generate some text proposals for that. Back to the procedure. RFC 6410 tells us we have to have 4 things to get a reclassification request through. 1, we need 2 independent interoperating implementations with widespread deployment and successful operational experience. So we need to generate the pointers to those. So there are implementations, lots more than 2 independent ones. There is some initial operational experience. But yeah, we have to see when exactly do we reach the threshold that we want to reach here. So widespread is an interesting term because widespread doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have 1 billion customers, but in the niche we are occupying, we want to have widespread deployment. Or we couldn't do something like a registration protocol to internet standard because only 20 people run this protocol. The second thing is no errata. As I said, we are going to have that in the new version. The third thing is no unused features that greatly increase implementation complexity. I would go one beyond that, and because the spec is fundamentally pretty simple, maybe we should look out whether we have any unused features. And number 4, if there are patent claims, we have to show that the licensing process works, but up to now there has been no IPR disclosure, and if there is one, then I would point to an RFC from 1978 that does approximately the same things. So that will be difficult. But yeah, people patent interesting things, so it might happen at any time. So for now, I think we have to focus on these 2 items here. Let's talk about unused features for a second. The best way to check for unused features is actually to do an implementation matrix that looks a bit like this, maybe. So we take a couple of implementations, maybe, yeah, we choose those wisely. I don't know which ones they are. I just put something in there on this slide. And then we fill in which of the features that the document has have been implemented there. And also probably for us, it's pretty interesting whether they actually interoperate. So let's find that out, even though 6410 no longer requires you to demonstrate that. They say wide deployment is demonstration of interoperability. But let's find that out as a working group. At least I'm proposing that. So what are the rows in this table? What are the features? How do you enumerate the features of CBOR? I made a very rough attempt here in the CBOR BIS wiki, and we probably should a look at that. Is this really the list of features, or do we want to be more fine-grained? So for instance, I'm just enumerating the tags here. Maybe a tag has 2 features in it. Let's have a look for that. So comments on this list would be useful, and then we should just start filling in the columns. So who in this room actually has an implementation of CBOR? That's always the problem at the IETF. The implementers don't come here. Stefan has half an implementation in widespread deployment. Is that in widespread deployment? Yeah, so I think right now the one with the widest deployment is TinyCBOR. There's also the Node CBOR implementation.
Joe has also an implementation from the chat. Joe has an implementation.
Yeah, that's Node CBOR. Or does he have another one?
Yeah, that's Node CBOR.
Okay. So it's sometimes a bit hard to find out who actually uses what, because this is currently often still in products that are used in internal positions. So let's try to find out a little bit more about those. Yes?
To the microphone, please.
What does IPFS use was the question? Is that your whole question?
Could you go to the microphone, please? We cannot hear you. And say your name. Thanks.
This room is not, half of the room is not allowed to say something. They have to come into this room.
You're just asking about implementations. I think the newest version of IPFS uses CBOR, and it's pretty widely deployed.
Yeah, so let's find out which implementation they use. That's a very good input. Thank you. That's also true for other protocols. So if I only could remember names. So when we will see wide deployment of web packages, Jeffrey? And you have to go to the microphone to answer that question?
No, actually, no. Cut that one off.
Okay. Good. Okay, so the result of that list should be, or could be, a list of tags where we think, well, it's kind of okay that we put them in 7049, but maybe they do not fulfill that part of the 6410 requirements that talk about widespread deployments. And they do increase implementation complexity. That's the other part of the 6410. And then we could move those over to a separate document. I mean, these are registered tags, so they are not going away, but they might not be part of the internet standard. Right now, I'm not sure we will find any tag that does this, but I think we should make an effort to answer that question, whether that would be okay. Alexei looks unhappy. Okay, good. So one other thing we could do in such a document, just as a random idea, there are some tags that have been registered by people somewhere with specifications somewhere that actually are pretty fundamental. So we might go ahead and collect these tags in a document to make the specifications that are scattered all over the internet more accessible. So people will find those tags and not get into a situation where they reinvent them because they are not finding them. So that might be another reason to start a PS, proposed standard level tags document. Okay, just an idea. Yeah, I think I covered that. So we just go on the lookout for widespread implementations, widespread deployment, and try to find what CBOR library is in there. So yeah, let me repeat my call to action. Please have a look at this wiki page. And
so can I?
Yes.
I think maybe the first step to fill up this implementation matrix would be to define which implementations are the most deployed, So I think that's not, at least it's not very clear to me. I don't know if anybody, I think that will be a good discussion in the mailing list. And once that's defined, like what are the columns, then we can ask for people's opinion about. What do you say, Alexei?
Yeah, just a sort of clarification in case it's not clear. For any feature, you need to have two independent implementations. They don't have to be the same tool for every feature.
Right.
Right. So,
Right.
you know, if you have 4 or 5 which you think are relatively widespread, and between them they cover all the features with at least 2 for each feature, that's good enough.
Yeah,
right.
that's good.
That is the text
Which
from
makes it slightly easier to actually find what you want.
So there are no unused features that greatly increase implementation complexity. So things that are just another line of code, we don't have to check for.
This is Paul Hoffman. So that was my question for Alexei is we have all of these tags that are optional and someone is defined. We don't know if they're going to be used in data anywhere. Does that count? Do we have to show uses of the tags? Or are those considered, do those come under the, that they did not increase complexity?
So you're saying that you might potentially have tags that nobody have implemented, but they don't increase complexity, so you want to keep them in the dock.
I don't think we have
tags that we don't know if somebody has implemented because they said we want this as an ability to tag things, but they didn't say where, and we don't have their data sets.
So by the end of next week, we won't have any tag that isn't implemented because I can implement the rest of the tags in an afternoon. That's not the problem. The problem is, do we have deployment experience with that?
Yeah, I need to look this up. I suggest fill in the table and see where the gaps, where the risk points are, and then decide whether they're small unused features, do they increase complexity or not, whether you want them in a separate document or not, and then you will see.
So just to give one potential example, and Paul will hate me for that, there is a tag for MIME messages. Now, what does it even mean to implement that? Have you to implement MIME to implement that tag? Or do you just have to hand the MIME message to an application?
Michael Richardson channeling Sean Leonard from the Jabber room asks, what does implementation mean? And maybe you just said that, because you can tag anything with anything in CBOR. Does it have to validate, reject non-conforming data? So
this is like the question, what do you have to implement in the first place to be conforming with this standard? And hopefully we don't have to define conformance here because it's really difficult to say that. So any implementation can just hand a tag that it finds together with the binary data that it found up to the application. And that's a way of implementing it, but that's maybe not what it was meant here. So let's see whether we find a little bit more implementation there.
So I would say let's go with what Alexei has said and also start mailing the mailing list about the tags issue. And I was curious about what do you think a timeline is for this?
We probably should be done by the end of September with that.
Okay.
Should not take more than 2 months to collect the information, because it's really just collecting information.
Okay.
We might find something after that time.
Of course.
Which changes.
But let's aim for an update by
Yeah.
the. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, and of course the other thing I don't have a slide for here is please do indicate those opportunities for editorial improvement that other slide talked about. So if you find some text that you think could be improved, just type into the GitHub page a comment. Just make sure that this is captured and we know you don't like it or you have a better wording, and we can think about good ways to handle it. Are we done?
Yeah, we can move forward.
Okay. So the next item, yes.
There might be questions on that, on the present, there might be questions on the presentation. On,
Yes.
yes.
Are there any questions on this presentation?
No? Okay. Sorry, we
Let's-
had an argument before and I didn't.
Yeah, let's expose this argument. I think it's important to think about this, even if the end result of the thinking is no action. The CBOR document currently does not say a lot about what the Unicode is you find in its UTF-8 strings. It's very, very clear that the UTF-8 has to be UTF-8. But it is not talking about non-characters and things like that. I think this is about the right level of specification here, but people may have different ideas about that. So it would be good to hear those. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Yeah, otherwise take it to the list and let's move on right now.
Okay, so CDDL. This document is in, excuse me, it's not an adoption call, in a confirmation call for the adoption decision we made in Chicago. The confirmation happened a little bit later. So you still have 2 days to respond to this confirmation call. So far, nobody has responded to it, which means the in-room consensus stands. So by Thursday morning, I hope we have a working group document here. So what's the status of the document? The authors think it's ready for working group adoption. We talked about that in Chicago. So the objective is to be referenceable from standards track documents so that they can write their data definitions in CDDL and don't have to copy them over to a form of stylized English as well. So normative text can use CDDL. And there are 2 ways of doing that. One is going for standards track. The other one is going for informational and getting some downref variants there. To me, it looks a bit more straightforward to go for standards track, but I don't really have an opinion. So I let the ADs and other people who know about process decide that. Standards track. Okay.
For everybody else, that was Alexei saying standards track.
So the second thing that happened recently is we had a discussion in Chicago and on the mailing list on the name. Now the name also is the name of open source license that everybody hates. So it's kind of weird to have a name where we know everybody hates it in a different context. But that also is an advantage, because this means this name is really not used for anything else because nobody wants to touch it. So when you Google CDDL, then you get 9 references to that Sun license, and then you actually get the language. So yeah, so I think it's a good idea to stay with that initialism because people already know it out there, and few people know what it actually stands for. And it originally stood for CBOR Data Definition Language. And the idea was to maybe make it concise data definition language. One reason for that is that the RFC editor will change the title of the document to concise binary object representation parenthesis CBOR parenthesis data definition language, and you will no longer understand what the title is referring to. And the other thing is, well, it actually works for JSON too. So maybe it's confusing to have a title that only lists CBOR. So that's where we are with the document. Are there any comments on that?
Francesca, not as chair. Just change the CBOR to concise. If I can quote you on the Google argument. I think that the first use for CDDL right now is CBOR, and I myself have looked for this document as CDDL CBOR when I ended up on the license, of course. So I don't know. I liked it there, but I understand.
I think Google will help you find it because the term CBOR does occur often enough in the document. But let's do a little bit of Googling to find out what the effect of this is. Okay, so since Chicago, we generated a -11, and there are very few technical changes in that -11. And actually, I'm quite proud that everything that was -05 CDDL specification still is a -11 CDDL specification. We changed a lot in the document, but for some reason we have managed to stay compatible, and we didn't even try particularly hard. So the one new thing here in -11 is we have a way to actually unwrap a group. And when you write a specification that is doing something like inheritance, where you have one structure that has a certain number of elements, field 1 and field 2, and you have another structure that has a few more elements, you currently have to define a group which you then reference from the first structure and from the second structure. And it's just a little bit easier to just reference the whole data structure, so you have to write much less to get this effect. So the tilde character here is standing for threading in something. So you're threading in the basic header into the advanced header. So these two specifications here are identical. So that's the only thing we did. And I actually have to confess, it's not implemented yet. I usually try to implement everything that's in the document in the CDDL tool, and this one I didn't get to. Sorry about that. But maybe by the end of next week. So the other technical change is the ABNF was unnecessarily restrictive in some cases. So you had to put things in parentheses in certain cases where it really wouldn't have been necessary to do that. And this is mostly affecting the control operator, which is the new name of the annotation operator. But again, it shouldn't change existing specifications. It just makes the likelihood that you will get an error message when you write something a little bit lower. We also made sure that all Unicode characters can be used. Now that's an interesting question. Does ABNF even allow us to do what we did? I think that's currently a little bit under discussion, but I hope that question is settled by the time we go to last call on this. So why is that important? Well, because people actually use constants that have non-ASCII, beyond ASCII characters in them, and having to write them in hex is just tedious. Yeah, and the third ABNF change is the unwrap operator. We added an appendix that talks about use with JSON. In the previous versions of the document, we just took this for granted. Now it turns out that there are a few points where you want to look slightly closer. And one of this is the weirdness that JSON has in its number system, or maybe the weirdness that CBOR has in its number system. And the problem is the weirdnesses are slightly different. So it's worth looking at that, look into this appendix and find out whether it's good enough for your JSON applications. Now, why didn't we go beyond that? We have had a lot of discussions about how much CDDL should talk about serialization details. So if you specify JSON, should you be able to say, whenever you write an exponent into a floating point number, don't use leading zeros in that exponent? That's the kind of representation constraint that people want to make. And I don't think CDL is the place where you should be doing that. So, yeah. You might want to have some global representation flags. I'll get to that later, but I think this fits with the rest of CDL reasonably well. Okay, but the whole number system, let's make one walkthrough through that number system. One other thing that was added is there is an appendix G that extends the diagnostic notation of 7049. Now, one could argue this should go into 7049 bis, but then that would be a change and would diminish from the argument this is a stable document that becomes internet standard. The counter argument is we even say you are not using diagnostic notation for interchange. So this is a change that by definition doesn't affect interchange. But still, I'm not sure that we should do that. So that's why the extended diagnostic notation right now is in this document, but of course we could split it out into a separate document if we think this muddies the waters with CDDL. Because really it's about CBOR, it's not about CDDL. It's a completely different syntax. And people do get confused about extended diagnostic notation for CBOR and CDDL. So yeah, I don't know. We can do that, we can not do that. Would be interesting to hear what people think about that. So the specific change here was we now have quite a few documents that actually encode something in CBOR and then put that into a byte string, which is then in turn happening in an enclosing CBOR document. In CDDL, we have .cbor and .cbor sequence as a way to specify that, so we're covered on the CDDL side, but the actual examples that make use of this are currently very hard to read. This just provides a way to write down that embedded CBOR and have the diagnostic notation parser expand that CBOR in place. It's a bit hard to generate because you cannot find out from a CBOR document whether something is embedded CBOR. You have to consult a schema for that. Yeah, it seems to work. So try it on cbor.me if you want to play with it. Yeah, there are a number of editorial changes. The main change that is kind of customer affecting is that we now call annotations controls, mainly because we might actually at some point want to have something like an annotation language for CDDL, and we would like to reserve the term annotation for annotations. When we started defining this construct, we thought we were going to use it for annotations, but it actually hasn't happened. So right now it's just a control operator. So we looked for a better name. We didn't find one. If you find a better name for this, please tell us. So this is a change in the description of CDDL, in the text description only. The language doesn't change. So it's still dot identifier as a binary operator. Now these continue to be the most important extension point of CDDL. So that's a place where we will see extension, in particular in connection with new tags that are coming in. And these tags may want to define their control operators to have a way of specifying what's in there. Generics, which were in an appendix called nursery, now have officially grown up, just because we have reports, people have used them and found them useful. We thinned the examples a little bit because the document was having way more examples than definitive text, and it still has more examples than definitive text, but it's getting a little more balanced. So we kept the ones that we think were more useful. And we moved the JSON-specific parts over into an appendix, so people who really want to use CDDL for JSON can have one place to look at and don't have to scan the document for that time case. So those are the editorial changes. Implementation status, the embedded CBOR is implemented in CBOR DIAC. The unwrap and ABNF changes are waiting for implementation. Now I'm currently rewriting the CDDL tool to make it a little bit easier to build tools around that, and that's why I didn't want to put this into the old tool, so it might take a couple of weeks before that's there. But that is just one tool, and really one implementation is not enough. So it would be nice if other people were implementing CDDL, except that I can't really tell you what it means to implement CDDL, because there are very, very different things that a program can do with a CDDL spec. So the tool that I wrote does about 4 things. It can check a CDDL spec, and it does this by just generating a completely random example. So it uses every choice point that is in the specification and generates a random result. So if you say x equals false or true, you get a false or you get a true randomly. So you run it 10 times, and then you get a pretty good feeling of what you just specified. This is, of course, not a new idea. There is a tool called ABNFGen. Everybody who loves ABNF has used ABNFGen and has been surprised by what they actually specify. Okay, the second thing the implementation does is it checks CBOR instances against the spec. And I think everybody who writes examples into RFCs thinks this is a useful feature to have. The third thing is the tool can actually pretty print some CBOR into diagnostic notation with comments that tell you which part of the CDDL specification was being exercised there. This support is still somewhat flaky, as Jim can testify, I think. But at least that's the idea. And the fourth one, we can extract C hash defines for all the numbers that are in the CDDL spec that just reduces typing a bit. But you can do lots of other things. You could pretty print CDDL itself. That would be really useful to have. You could have some application-specific consistency condition that you want to add to a standard CDDL processor. You could write tools for the management of number spaces. So something like the SID tool we have for Yang, we might want to do something like that for CDDL. And I want to support this ecosystem by defining a JSON format for CDDL, which of course is maybe contradicting what I'm always saying. You shouldn't use JSON to define JSON. You should use a readable language. But for interchange between tools, that's a good thing to have. So yeah, find some bright young grad student and get them to write an interesting CDDL tool. What still has to be done? On the technical side, we have had these discussions about the numeric system in CDDL. There were some clarifications, but maybe the clarifications are not enough. So there were some discussions on the mailing list from a guy whose company, whose day job is to write ASN1 tools. And then he read the spec and said, how do you handle this case? And nice comment. Serialization constraints, I talked about that briefly. We may actually want to have a couple of serialization constraints as a separate language. Just switches you can flip on and off. And yeah, we may want to think about better error messages. Everybody who has tried to check their CBOR examples against the CDDL tool has experienced the CDDL tool saying no, and then you change something and says no, and it would be nice if we had a way to get better error messages, and maybe the spec writer has to help a little bit here. On the editorial side, we want to make one terminology walkthrough. We have noticed some inconsistent use of terminology, and maybe it would be a good idea to actually define a few more terms while we do this. The introductory material is lacking, so people always ask, wait a minute, there is Yang, so why is there a CDDL? Aren't they doing the same thing? No, they are not doing the same thing, and we should explain that. And yes, editorial comments very welcome. Again, just go to the GitHub repo, start typing comments on places that you think are hard to read or are misleading. Okay, that's CDDL.
Okay. Comments? I think. Okay, one is coming. And Joe wants to say something. Go ahead.
Sorry for sitting on the side of the room that's not allowed to comment.
Your name?
Sorry, I'm Jeffrey Yaskin. So I'd like to use CDDL from other specifications, and the kind of the phrasing that I'd like to use is parse these bytes as this CDDL item.
Mm-hmm.
With the current kind of arrangement of the spec, that's not precisely defined. It's reasonably clear what it means, but it would be nice if in a kind of a future version of the draft, there were a very precise definition of like where you go in the draft to see what that means.
Yeah. So the question that is lurking behind that is when you write a grammar, one semantics of that grammar may be an acceptance test. So the grammar kind of enumerates all the valid languages, sentences in that language. That's what CDDL currently is defined as. Now, what maybe you want to have is when you pass something with a CDDL spec, you get an abstract syntax tree that is shaped like this. I think that also would be useful, but it kind of is a different project.
I think that the way that CDDL defines the grammar, the kind of the set of items that fall into a rule, is not as clear as it should be.
Okay, so you want to fix the acceptance part?
Yes.
Okay, let's do that. So you did send some comments to the mailing list already,
Yes,
and I'm looking forward to more comments
Okay.
of this kind.
Joe now. We are not hearing you, Joe. Mythical, I don't know.
While we are waiting for Joe, he can cut me off at any time.
Okay.
One thing I don't have a slide for is when do we want to be done? Yeah, my hope is this is kind of the last round.
Okay, so
Yes, that's what the milestone tells me. Yesterday, yes. So working with Last Call before Chicago, before Singapore, excuse me.
okay. Before that, I wanted to ask who has strong objection to moving this to the standard track. Please speak now, and we will confirm it in the main list anyway. No one. Okay. He just. Okay, Joe, we cannot hear you. Maybe, yeah, try to relate to the Jabber. Or see the microphone issue. I don't know.
Joe gives up. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, he gave up. Oh, okay, that's good.
I think Sean Leonard wants to say that he has objections to standards track. Not a solid objection, but the CDL document seems to be changing quite a bit with innovations. So concerns. Joe, type. See what the round trip time to Joe is.
Okay.
I think he has the same concerns as Sean. He says, look, I'd like to get the name nailed down before we go too far.
The name?
This is Joe as
That's
chair.
Joe, yeah, as chair.
So the nail not holding that we put in after Chicago. Yeah, maybe we have to discuss this offline.
Yeah, let's.
So I think the comment I heard was we need to get the name nailed down.
Yeah, the CDDL,
Yes.
the document name. So maybe let's take it on the mailing list, and also let's talk about moving it to standard track, see the concerns, and Hank, yes.
Yeah, so this is Hank. So we have a set of preconditions we have to satisfy in order to move to the question if we're going to standards track, if I understand this correctly. And one of the preconditions is that we nail down the name. Just to make this clear, and if there are no objections to these questions on the Jabber, I would think this is a precondition. Then I heard that there's a lot of technical innovation in the draft.
I hope so.
And yeah, I would call it more like obvious evolution, but yes.
We are applying concepts that were invented in the 60s.
Yes,
and,
so yeah, so
applying
the
concepts
innovation
is
might be
innovation.
more obvious than it looks like, but it's more like common sense. But if there are any objection to what is perceived as innovation in this draft that might be a blocker, please also raise this on the list very soon, so we can nail this down as another precondition.
Also, just a note that accepting a document as a working group item does not mean that is the end-all be-all of the document. It can still evolve within the working group.
Yeah, Alex Imanov, just a quick comment. You know, the status of the document, once it's done, has nothing to do with the rate of changes. You know, I think that's one thing is asking whether it's stable and unlikely to change, and the entirely separate decision whether it's informational or standard track. I don't think they actually affect each other really. It's just, you know, changes is about when you're going to get done, or, you know, or at least stable, unchanging core of the document.
Okay, so we are a bit late, so last comment.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Alexei. So this is clarifying for me. Thank you very much. So I thought it would be something, innovation might inhibit it becoming standard track. So that was my concern. If you are not concerned about this, I'm okay with that. Oh, sorry.
Real last comment now.
Well, if you have extensions or features in CDDL you're not sure about, you can always move them to a separate document, right? That lets, you know, as long as the core is stable, you can publish core and then, you know, deal with the rest.
And also users can opt not to use those features. Okay, so there are two more items on the working group charter. And I think we are not talking about one because we still have to find out what the authors actually want to suggest. The other one is the array tags document that was originally suggested by Jonathan Roach. And so I just helped him a little bit in making this, turning this into an internet draft format. So I believe this is pretty much cooked. It hasn't changed for a while. So this is maybe a document that also helps as an instance for understanding why we want to change the IANA considerations. This document requests 26 tags. And I think we have to think about which kind of tags these are going to be. Typed arrays should be known to anyone who works with JavaScript or works with graphics or both. And this is just essentially a way to transport typed arrays identified as such in a CBOR document. Now, typed arrays come in a large number of variants. So they have 4 different lengths. They come in unsigned, signed, and float. And yes, they come in big endian and little endian. And this is the one way where I actually agree with the idea of having a way to interchange something in little endian form. So there's this guy from NASA who was talking to me about their massive HDF5 files. And he wants to use CBOR, not to replace HDF5, that would be stupid, but just to send indexes of these files around. So these are way more complicated data structures, so HDF5 is not sufficient for that. And he wants to use CBOR to represent these indexes. And it helps if they don't have to swap the bytes for doing that. So this is, all this hasn't been invented, but it's just the JavaScript typed array. So you can look into ECMA 262 for the details of that. And this essentially was stolen from the Kronos graphics standards. So I think technically this is pretty stable. The way this is encoded in the form of CBOR tags, of course, can be discussed. And there are two innovations here. One is a tag for turning a one-dimensional array into a multi-dimensional one, because that's just a normal thing you do when you interchange a multi-dimensional array. In JavaScript, you do a typed array, and then you say, oh, by the way, this is not a 9-element array, but it's a 3x3 element array. And this is what this tag does. And finally, there is a tag that declares an array as homogeneous, which is a little bit unrelated to the other two, because it's not about typed arrays, which are always homogeneous, but it's about normal CBOR arrays, and it sometimes can help an implementation to know this is going to be all integers, this is going to be all floats, and so on. So this is the technical content. Yeah, comments, welcome. So I think the only remaining question is there a Jabber comment?
Comment from Joe, way too many tags. He thinks we should have one tag with an array type, actual array should work fine. So I think he wants to have a tag and then something, some sub part of it. And Sean Leonard says, when I reviewed this originally proposed last year, I was okay with the quantity of tags, but opposed to them being in the 2-byte space. In the 4-byte space, no big deal.
Right. So let's talk about the first thing. Obviously, one way to do a structure that essentially is 2 parts, for instance, an exponent and a mantissa, or here a type of an array and the actual bytes of the array, is to have a 2-element array with information and the actual contents tagged by a tag. Yes, you can do that. An implementation will maybe allocate a 2-element array when processing this. On the wire, it's just a couple bytes more. So since we have tags, and we have really many tags we can allocate, why not allocate consecutive ranges of tags to do this kind of encoding? So I think it's much easier for an implementation to handle this. But of course, that's a style question. So I acknowledge Joe's style, and some of the tags in the original 7049 actually work that way. So both styles are good. Now, why did we suggest 2-byte tags? Some of these arrays are going to be huge. And yeah, large tags might work for them very well. However, sometimes arrays are pretty short. And one of the applications that people have rubbed under my nose a lot is having an RGB color. And an RGB color is 3 bytes. And it would be nice if it was possible to tag this RGB color and have the whole thing still be of a reasonable size. So the fact that the arrays can be huge doesn't mean they have to be huge.
Joe says that taking so many tags sets a bad precedent. And
It
he would
is,
like
yes.
a sub thing.
So it needs a very, very good
Sean
explanation.
says My concern with Joe's proposal is that now we need another sub-registry for the type tag. Not truly a tag, it's an enumeration. So I agree with Karsten and the draft. And then Joe says, we can discuss this offline.
I agree.
Okay, so this is not the hill I want to die on. So I'm not saying this must be done this way, but I think it's the right way we should do this. Okay, how much time do we have left?
Yeah, we're a bit late, 5 minutes.
Okay.
But before we move forward, I just wanted to, since this work is in the charter, know how many people have read this draft? Please show of hand. I see 4. I see.
And Joe and Sean.
Yeah, 5, 6, 7. Okay, and I think that it would be good to have some reviews, right? So please, yeah, who is willing to review this from people who have raised their hands? Paul, I don't see behind. Jim.
Paul and Jim.
Okay, great, thank you. And before we move to the uncharted work, if you're done, or is there anything?
Yeah, I didn't say it because it seemed kind of obvious, but I'd rather have the answer for this question before we make this a working document. But we can do it the other way around. I don't care.
Yeah, of course, but I think that there should be some discussion on this document since it has not, I've not seen much in the mailing list, so I would like some people to
the mailing list is younger than this document.
Yeah. Okay.
So Michael Richardson, so we actually should adopt the document simply so that we can allocate enough time to argue over it. Because otherwise it's not really, it's not really a working group document, so we shouldn't spend more than a couple minutes on it.
But it's in the charter, believe it or not.
Okay, so before...
My alternate proposal is 2.
I said let's move on since we're late. Before we, or it's okay then. Before we move to, go ahead.
Many ways to skin a cat. So let's get the technical questions answered and do the process questions while we do that. Okay, shall I go? So the next couple of slides are all about tag definitions that have cropped up in various environments. Our charter tells us we should be working on 2 tag documents. One is the array tags and one is the object ID tags document, where I said the authors still have to fight that one out. But of course, other people are asking for tags. And maybe this is the gong show part here, where we just go through these tags and quickly see, are people interested in working on this? One thing that came up with 7049 is that the time tag in there has some intrinsic resolution issues. This is for tag 1, where we have a POSIX time. And we haven't really provided a way to do a POSIX time to a decimal fraction or to a precision that is better than about a millisecond. And of course, people need better time. And we also haven't done all the other things you want to do about time. And we have working groups working on time. So it's a difficult thing. We don't want to boil the ocean here. But there was one specific request we got from the Haskell community who are using time tags that use picoseconds. And there is no good way to represent them in CBOR. And it's probably better if we have one tag that actually does that everybody uses than that we have a Haskell specific time tag. So security automation probably wants to have more intent information in timestamps, and the IoT applications often use time scales that are different from the POSIX scale. The POSIX scale is nonlinear, and nonlinear is an anathema for many control applications. So you need monotonic timescales there. So this is not all done in this document at this point in time. One discussion we had was, can we expand the existing tags? But we quickly gave up on that. We don't really want to be shackled by what's in the document right now. So we defined a new tag, and we actually have an allocation here because CBOR is so allocation friendly. We just went to IANA, hey, give us an FCFS tag, and we got one. So 1001 is now a tag for time. And while we were at it, we just got 1002 for duration and 1003 for period. We haven't even filled in the details for that yet, but got the allocation. Okay, so the idea is to define these things as maps with member keys, and the numbers of those keys are either positive or they are negative. The negative numbers are kind of additional information, and the positive ones define the time. So we have 1 for a POSIX time like in tag 1, 4 for decimal fraction, and 5 for a big float. So we can solve all the resolution problems that anyone might have. But we also have specific additions in the, oops, this should be millisecond, microsecond, nanosecond, and so on. So you can have millisecond additions, microseconds, and so on. So this is in the current document, and this is the document against which the tag was registered. But we probably can go ahead and extend the document and have things like timescales in there and so on. Yeah, so we are not a time working group, and I know that there are lots of people who know way more about time. But if we do this slowly and fill in this key space slowly based on good feedback that we have, we might be able to do something useful. By the way, on last Friday, POSIX time reached 1.5 billion. I hope you all celebrated that. It was at 4:40 in the morning in my time zone. So we are at 1.5 billion, 299,400 when the working group meeting started. I don't know where we are at the moment. Okay. Second thing, the LPWAN working group is defining compression mechanisms for doing internet things in a millibit kind of environment where you have about a millibit per second of sustained throughput. And so they are really interested in compression. And one thing that is useful is to define something like a template statically. So you have a data structure and you define a template. And then when you actually transmit things, you only transmit the variables in the data structure. And then the decompressor puts this all together again in a way that can be processed by the application. So it's extremely simple. This is just tag 42 it has to be allocated. It hasn't been allocated yet. Yeah, it's probably a good idea because these templates have to be interchanged on the same millibit links, but only initially. It's probably a good idea to have something short here, but yeah, we are in the 2-byte space again. I think we have had this discussion. So this is for LPWAN, not LWPAN. That would be also an interesting work item. Yeah, I think that's something we can keep an eye on. Third thing, in the W3C work about thing descriptions, a question came up: how do we represent these thing descriptions between nodes? And right now, these are JSON LD documents, not LSON LD documents. It was late yesterday evening. These have lots of shared structure. Normally, RDF documents don't have lots of shared structure because RDF is defined that way. But JSON LD is a kind of flattened out RDF. So you have lots of repetitions. And when you actually interchange these things and you compress them, you compress them down by a factor of 5 or so. So the question is, if we want to interchange these things that have shared structure, repeated strings, and a lot of strings with mostly the same prefixes, is there maybe a good way to do that in CBOR? And of course, one way is to run a conventional data compression algorithm, like deflate. We have this convenient RFC 1951 that everybody has implemented everywhere. So we might just use it, and it's actually very successful in reducing the size of thing descriptions, but it requires the receiver to actually decompress everything before they can process it. They cannot take parts and work on that from memory. They essentially have to generate a decompressed copy while working. And that is kind of defeating the purpose, because we want to get these data structures into very small systems, and they just may not fit in decompressed state. So we were looking at ways for, instead of using traditional data compression, packing the information a little bit. And this is actually work that was started by Joe Hildebrand some 3.5 years ago. I took his draft of the time and slightly modified it by saying, okay, we take the original data structure, but everything in here that is actually used more than once is moved over into a shared pool, which is just an array of subtrees. And the data point to this array using some new pointer structures that we have to have. And common string prefixes, which occur a lot with URIs, those get their own pool and also can be referenced. But those references, of course, have the suffix in them. So they are not clean references, they also have a suffix in them. So I implemented this in 205 lines of code just to see whether it's hard to do it. No, it's not hard. And now the question is, how do we actually represent these shared references and these prefix references in CBOR? And now this is probably the most ruthless proposal for spending IANA code points. Let's see how well that gets accepted. First of all, because nobody has been using those simple tags, we might really take a big bite out of them. So I'm arguing that we should take 2/3 of the simple space and a chunk of 2/3 of the 1 byte simple space and a chunk of the 2 byte simple space, and then maybe even allocate a 1 byte tag to be able to expand on this. So this would make sure there is no artificial limitation to the number of shared structure elements. So that's something. And for the prefix references, I propose to allocate number of tags, 32 tags in the 2 byte space and 512 tags in the 3 byte space. There are lots of 3 byte tags, so we could do more than 512, but at some point it stops to be constrained device relevant. So we only can have 564 best prefixes. Maybe that's enough, but 640K is enough for everyone. Anyway, so we did this experiment with one of the test thing descriptions that were used in the testbed of the W3C Plugfest last week. And that is a JSON file that has 3,116 bytes. There's lots of white space in there, so this is not a reasonable number. So if you take out the white space, this is a JSON file with 1,447 bytes. And you can see deflate really lets the air out of those. And even cheap algorithms like LZ4, which is something that you might want to do on a microcontroller, actually still give you pretty good compression. So this is a little bit the benchmark here. And CBOR represents exactly the same data in 1210 bytes. Deflate actually is slightly less efficient here because the JSON stuff really has a lot of redundancy that you can work on. And the packed mechanism using only semantic sharing uses 793 bytes, which is not so good. But with the prefix compression, we go down to 564. So that's getting close. It's still twice as much as sending the deflate version, but then you can work on it. You don't have to decompress it to work on it. So it looks like this is an approach to maintain processability. Prefix sharing is good for working with URLs. And well, I still have to fix my implementation to actually find all redundancy cases. So there's still a little bit, if you look into one of the lists here, there's still a little bit of redundancy in here. So we could probably get down to like 530 bytes, 520 bytes in that example. So the one thing that W3 is probably going to add is a static dictionary. So a number of the strings that are in here are going to be everywhere. So a JSON LD document talking about media types is going to have the string application /JSON in it. So you might as well put that into a static dictionary that is on all devices, and you don't even have to represent it because the implementation will know that thing is application JSON. Okay, so that's another tag that once we recharter, we may want to look at.
And from Joe Hildebrand, he says, I showed how to do with exactly one tag allocation. Using more than that is proliferate.
Yes,
I think it's a war.
The way Joe did it requires that you actually do the decompression while sequentially scanning the document. While this mechanism here actually can be used incrementally. So yeah, it's slightly different. Maybe he hasn't read the document yet. Yeah, so if the objective is to save tag space, this is a really bad proposal. If the objective is to represent data in an efficient way, this is a pretty reasonable proposal. The main reason I wanted to bring this up is so you know what kind of requests might hit us in the IANA consideration space for 7049.
Thank you, Carsten. We have 5 minutes left. I know that Sean wanted to say something. If there is any comments or interest in this work, please bring it to the mailing list, of course. So I think he's just writing in Jabber instead, so I'll read what he writes. Just a reminder to the working group that there is a charter working group document, the OID, Draft Borman CBOR tags OID 06 for the OID tags and other identifier as well as other topics. Please review the work, and it also includes content about fixing or better specifying certain tags. It hasn't changed since the March meeting, so we may want to get some reviews on that as well. Any other comments? Anything else? The blue sheets? Okay. Then we are done. Thank you very much.